Thank you, choir, and Josh, and thanks for that meeting. Appreciate it. Well, 46 years ago, down the road a bit in a Modesto courthouse, Nancy and I were married way back in 1979 on this very day. And if you don't do the math, it's 46 years. And Nancy looked so beautiful in the wedding photos, wearing a lovely dress with a shawl and cute shoes. I'm a different story. I look very happy, but pretty goofy in a velvet clip-on bow tie, black crushed cord bell bottoms, and a gray vest, all of which we got on clearance at Murphy's. And the white shirt and gray sports coat were from Goodwill, and I think we paid full price for the pair of brown suede wavy sole shoes, which I'm quite certain were never intended to go with black cord bell bottoms. At best, I appear in the photos as someone who learned to buy stage costumes at thrift stores and applied it to his wedding. And for the record, I've not worn that outfit since. And I have two main takeaways from that wedding outfit. One is that Nancy must have really loved me because she saw me in the outfit before we drove from Turlock. And she still said, I do. And the other takeaway is that you can pretty much tell from my attire and the courthouse ceremony that we were pretty poor at the time. And starting out in a lower economic strata, we stayed in it for many years. And like many, if not most, in poverty, we had jobs. And we were really good workers. We were just poor. And I know from experience that our experience wasn't unique. Thankfully, during those years, we didn't find ourselves without a home like we actually might have today. In this day and age, we see so many people experiencing poverty, many without a house or apartment, many without adequate food or health, and all of them without sufficient care for well-being in our country. And while our nation has insufficient care for the least among us, Jesus cares for them and calls his followers to care for them. And Jesus also taught that nations are judged by how they care for the poor. As a one-time poor person, as an empathetic person, as a Christian, as a minister, I care a great deal for those in need of food and shelter and health care. And you know what? Most faith communities and their members care. I know this church and its members care. And one worry I have about so many leaving faith communities and faith communities in crisis and closing is that we are losing the primary source of compassionate help for the poor in America. The poor are here, and faith communities help them. We are needed to help them. For Christians, theologically, we think of ourselves as the body of Christ in action, doing what Christ would do. Tending to the poor is high on Christ's list, and tending to the poor is high on the list of most churches. And so my ears perk up when I hear today's lesson, which on the surface seems to portray Jesus, the first body of Christ, callously, even selfishly, brushing off the waste of a valuable asset on his feet and on Mary of Bethany's hair. At first blush, Jesus' words, you always have the poor, but you won't always have me. It seems so uncaring, so out of character. And when I first heard our lesson way back when, I felt Judas, regardless of his motive, was right. The perfume should have been sold to help the poor, and it was hard to get past that in Jesus' words about having the poor always. Having been poor, my heart aches when resources get wasted on seemingly frivolous uses, especially in our culture where those who hold the majority of financial resources don't even get taxed on them in the higher percentage the rest of us pay. And they seem to waste resources on frivolity. A number of very wealthy sure seem to often be uncaring and unwilling to help those in need, to not do their share for the welfare of the least among us. And we can see this in very high relief these days, as some of the richest in the world help gut national programs that help the poor while seeming to gather more and more riches for themselves. It just doesn't feel right. And I found over the years that those who have experienced being poor, when asked what they do if they came into great wealth, like winning the lottery, the answer I usually hear includes giving much of it away to help those in need. Many claim they could never keep such wealth to themselves because there are too many people that need it more than they need something extravagant like a yacht, a jet, super fancy car, giant diamond rings, piles of money in the bank, or even very, very, very expensive perfume to wash their feet or enhance their hair. And to be fair, in my experience, it's not just the poor who make helping others their lottery winning dream. Many folks do. Along similar lines, many people can't understand the need for any person to amass billions of dollars and hoard them when those resources could help so many others. Some of the wealthiest have amassed enough to solve city, state, country, and even worldwide issues. Yet, they don't do it. They hoard resources, even knowing they can never spend it on themselves in many lifetimes, let alone the one that they are living now. It's not illegal to amass billions and not help those in need. It is immoral. It's not following biblical teachings or the way Jesus set out, making it unchristian and sinful. And while the majority of Christians seem to get that we need to use resources to help the poor, our story today appears to make it Judas-like, to question when valuable resources are not used to help the poor. Even worse, on the surface, the story seems to suggest Jesus is okay with thinking that there will always be poor, so why not use the wealth for what we want? Since it's not going to end poverty. Frivolity that makes us happy, money would be a better use. That surface understanding of the reading is not in line with Jesus' way set out in the rest of the Gospels. And it followed that understanding leads to a pretty slippery slope. A slippery slope, it sure seems like some very wealthy megachurch pastors have slid down, using it to excuse pouring wealth on frivolities instead of on Christ found in the least among us. And reading the lesson to allow such shameful use of church offerings because there will be poor always sure doesn't match up with Christ in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Those Gospels teach Jesus came to preach good news to the poor. Jesus taught the rich have as much chance of experiencing the empire of God as getting a camel through the eye of a needle. And Jesus taught we must take care of the poor as if they are Christ himself. And even if we stick with the Gospel of John in chapter 13, we find Jesus commanding us to love one another. Not to mention John 3's famous assertion that Jesus was sent here because God so loved the world. How is hoarding wealth while they're suffering poverty love? It's not. So what's going on in our lesson? What does Jesus mean when he answers Judas' concerns about not using a resource for the poor with the troubling phrase, you always have the poor, and you won't, but you won't always have me? And many commentaries focus on the first part of that troubling phrase, and I'm going to get to it too, but I find the second part quite telling. So I'm going to start there because I find Jesus saying you won't have me always striking. A primary idea in Christianity is that Jesus is with us always. He lives on. And Jesus says as much in Matthew 28, quote, remember, I am with you always to the end of the age, end quote. And the Gospel of John, where our lesson comes from, is a very spiritual book full of symbolism and signs. which also suggests this. John's pre-Easter Jesus claims he's meant to always be about as the bread of life, the light of the world, the light of life, the resurrection, and the life. And John reports post-Easter experiences of Jesus being with us eternally in one form or another. After Easter, Jesus appears to his followers in person. And in one of John's stories, the resurrected Jesus famously tells Peter to feed my sheep. Jesus doesn't say, don't worry about feeding them and go ahead and waste resources on yourself. And all this makes me wonder if it's true that Jesus is always with us and cares for the poor. Why does John tell us Jesus said to Judas, you always have the poor, but you won't always have me? Did you hear I punctuated the two U's in that sentence and pointed out it was said to Judas? That's a hint at the answer. Jesus is talking to Judas, who John already told us takes money from the poor and the Jesus movement. We can't tell it from just the reading, but Jesus responds to the clobbering of Judas with Torah, the commandment in Deuteronomy 15:11 to be exact. Jesus uses a rabbi-shortened reference to that commandment, which reads, quote, since there will never cease to be some in need on the earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor in your land, end quote. Jesus needles Judas with that reference and adds another dig. Judas' way is not caring for the poor. Judas' way is gleefully wanting the perfume sold so he could steal more from the disciples' purse and the mouths of the poor. This greed hints at what John and his audience know, that Judas' way leads to selling out Jesus, and that he won't always have Jesus. And Jesus knows that too. Simply put, under Judas' way, there will always be poor. And under Judas' way, he won't always have Jesus. When Jesus' words are directly applied to Judas, you always have the poor, but you won't always have me. They nail Judas for what he is and the consequences of his choice. Judas doesn't open his hand to the poor and the needy neighbor and won't always have Jesus because he abandoned him. And that sounds like the story we know, the Jesus we know, the Jesus of the Gospels. And I intended to end the sermon at that, but I've yet to explain why Jesus lets the expensive perfume be doused on his feet and in Mary's hair. Mary of Bethany's family appears to have had some wealth. They not only housed gatherings, but had a family burial vault and readily available, very, very expensive burial perfume. And Mary of Bethany appears to be the only follower at the gathering who understands Jesus is very likely to be crucified by Rome. John and his audience, living many decades after the crucifixion, know that Rome killed him. But in the story, only Jesus and Mary of Bethany seem to grasp that it's on the horizon. And in that era, it was very important to properly honor the body of the dead. That's why the Easter stories have people coming to the grave after the Sabbath is over to make things right and honor the body of Christ they expected to find in the tomb. And the process of Rome's crucifixions often included, more often than not actually, letting the body rot on the cross and be eaten by animals until it was no more. And so it was unusual to bury the body of someone crucified. So Mary of Bethany had no way of knowing if Jesus' body would otherwise get the honor it deserved. And so Mary literally gives a part of her family wealth to honor the body of Christ. She does this in a very intimate manner in front of others. And to people like Judas, she acted foolishly for the love of Jesus, something Paul tells us all to do later. And she literally pours wealth on the poor man, Jesus. Symbolically, she pours wealth onto the body of Christ. A nice metaphor for Jesus teaching that when we pour resources on the poor, we pour resources on Christ. And it's also a nice metaphor for all Christians who later call the church the body of Christ and provide resources to it. Mary of Bethany gives to the body of Christ generously and carefully with deep, deep kindness and love. She gives of herself. And she's given back personal time with Jesus. And she gives, and it's given back in another sense. And forgive the pun, but the sense of aroma in the oil that we were told filled the house would have lasted on Jesus all Holy Week long. And it would have lingered on her too, no doubt, as a memory the rest of her life. Because Mary cared, the body of Christ was honored, and it got what it needed. And she will always have Jesus. And Mary of Bethany epitomizes a faithful follower, providing what she can out of her wealth and giving devotion to the body of Christ. To the world, Mary may have seemed a fool for Christ, but to Christians, Judas should seem the real fool. The way Judas leads to the poor being with us always and to his not having Christ always. Judas' way does not lead to Jesus' way. The way Mary takes leads to the body of Christ being honored and able to do what needs to be done. It leads to continued help for the poor through the body of Christ, continuing on in the church ever since. Mary of Bethany's way leads to Jesus' way and to Jesus being with us always. May we all be like